Hello everyone, my name is Peter Houston and I'm the archivist at Mount Royal. And today I'm going to be talking to you about illuminated manuscripts from the medieval period. I'm going to be talking about how they were produced and used, and also a bit about who would have owned these manuscripts at the time. Finally, too, we're going to talk a bit about the print revolution and how that really changed how books were produced in Europe. And we're going to focus in on sort of the illustration of books in this period. So looking at woodcuts and metal cut prints. All right, let's get started. So we're going to be taking a look at a number of items in the holdings of the Mount Royal University Archives and Special Collections. We have a nice teaching collection of medieval manuscripts, about 50 leaves. So a leaf is an individual page of a manuscript. So about 50 leaves. We don't have any complete manuscripts. They're really expensive. But yeah, 50 manuscript leaves from all over Western Europe that nicely illustrate medieval book production. We're also going to look at some early printed books, some examples of those. We do have three complete books from the first sort of century and a half of book production before 1600, as well as a number of leaves taken out of books as well. Okay, so what you see in front of you is a nice example of a medieval manuscript leaf. This comes from a French Book of Hours. A Book of Hours is a sort of Christian devotional book, very popular in the Middle Ages. We'll talk more about that in a bit. But yeah, so I should begin with the definition. So manuscript basically means handwritten, and a manuscript book is just any book that is sort of written out by hand by a scribe. Which before the printing press was invented, it was the way that all books were produced. It was the way that knowledge and ideas were disseminated in Europe. So you can imagine writing out an entire book by hand is going to take an awful long time. So because of that, and then also because of the materials involved, which we'll also discuss, books were extremely expensive and therefore treasured. And a surprising number of medieval manuscript books have survived to present day. So we're going to look at a number of examples from our collections. We have, yeah, those two collections with a good number of examples. So let's talk a little bit about the process of making a manuscript, a handwritten book. Well, first of all, you need a writing material. So the example here, what it looks like paper, but it's not paper. It is parchment, which was very sort of the most common writing surface used in the medieval period. So parchment is animal skin. They have, I mean, they'd use a wide variety of different types of animals, often cows, especially sort of young cows, which would produce sort of a lighter, more, I don't know, fine kind of parchment. Also things like goats and sheep in other parts of Europe, say in the south and along the Mediterranean, were quite common. And even in some cases hunted game, so deer or other kind of hides. And basically what you do is the animal is slaughtered, they're skinned, and then a parchmenter, that's someone whose entire job is to make parchment, would then take the skins of the slaughtered animal, scrape them out, so remove all the hair from the one side and sort of the flesh from the other, scrape it out as much as possible, and then stretch it out and let it dry. And this is to flatten it because, of course, it wants to sort of stay in the shape of the animal. So you need to stretch it out and let it dry. They would then scrape it out even further, get it to, in the case like this one that you see on screen, it's actually very, very, very thin, almost sort of rice paper thin. You can see, if we kind of zoom in a bit, you can see an illuminated initial painted on the reverse side. You can see it right through the material. This is a very fine grade of parchment, known as vellum, which would, as I was saying, often made from sort of younger calves. And this stuff would be super expensive. I mean, that's one thing about medieval books is, you think your typical book, whether it's a book of hours or a Bible or a book on canon law, if you have a book that's a couple hundred pages long, you think how many animals must have been slaughtered to produce a single book. It's actually quite staggering, considering one calfskin might give you maybe 3 to 4 kind of medium-sized sheets of parchment. So yeah, just the sheer number of animals that go into producing a book speaks to the cost of part of the cost of creating a manuscript. Um, like you can see in this example here, many medieval manuscripts were lavishly illuminated. This one is very small. That's one thing you can't really tell by looking at it on the screen. It's about this big, maybe a little smaller than a paperback book, but just covered in these decorative borders, illuminated initials, gold leaf, these bright colors, and there's a number of reasons, and I'm going to discuss this throughout the presentation, but a number of reasons why medieval people sought to sort of beautify their books with these incredible illuminations. Illumination, too, I should say, comes from the Latin word to lighten or brighten, and it really refers to the sort of use of gold leaf and silver in these that would reflect the light and just add sort of a stunning quality to these manuscripts. Things like this. This one has this funny kind of mythical creature. I'm not actually sure what it is. It looks like sort of a bishop's head with the hat, with the body of maybe a centipede. I think sometimes illustrations would illustrate the text or have sort of religious purposes. This one, even though it's a religious text, I think is really just meant to kind of amuse the reader, to decorate the page. Often these were luxury items. And so, yeah, I think really speaks to the wild kind of medieval imagination. But okay, so let's move on. I want to talk about the wide variety of sizes of medieval books, medieval manuscripts. So here's 2 examples. These are both from our collection. The little tiny circle that you see at the bottom is supposed to be a loonie. So that kind of gives you a sense of scale. I've tried to size these to about the size that they are in real life. So the one on the left you see is another Book of Hours page from England from the 1440s. It is quite small, as you can tell by how it compares to the loonie. It's smaller than most paperbacks today. Whereas the leaf on the right is massive. It is absolutely huge. It's a Spanish antiphonal leaf, so this is a choir book. What you can see, it has musical notation that's for Gregorian chant, and you can draw a lot out of the size of medieval manuscripts as to what their use was. So something like a Book of Hours, it's meant to be small and portable, lightweight, easy to transport around, because the idea with the Book of Hours is there's 8 times a day, the canonical hours, when you're supposed to open up your book of Hours. That's why it's called the Book of Hours, and say sort of prayers, do Bible readings. It's kind of a daily meditative, reflective, religious practice. So therefore, it needs to be small and lightweight and easy to carry around. So small size. The choir book leaf would be a stationary sort of item. It would stay in. This would have been used likely in a monastery or abbey or convent, a monastic house of some sort. And it's big, partly because there's no reason to make it portable, because it would stay in the church of the monastic house, and it would be used in the sort of daily round of chanting and prayer that the monks or nuns engaged in. It's also really big because you'd have an entire choir, a monastic choir, gathered around this, chanting from the choir book during those sort of daily services. So I love I don't know if you can, if you can see on that, it has this incredible, I can't zoom in too much, but this huge illuminated R, which is quite something. I think this one's really interesting too, because it's in kind of an Islamic style with the real. And then you can see inside of the letter, there's all these very geometric kind of patterns, which, I think really speaks to the fact this would have been produced in the late 15th century, probably the 1490s, right around the time that the sort of Christian, what they called the reconquest of Spain, basically the destruction of the Islamic kingdoms of Spain was reaching its final phase. And so, but you can see their influence in the way that this leaf has been decorated. So it's very abstract, geometric kind of decoration. All right, then, let's talk more about, we've gone over parchment, and so the sheets of parchment would be cut down to size depending on what the book was. either very small for a portable book, bigger for something like the choir book you see. And then it would go to the scribe. So this is a really nice contemporary illustration pulled from one of our early printed leaves. This is a 16th century Latin Bible. And I love this picture of the scribe because it really shows a scribe at work with all the tools that they would use. So scribes, you can see he's working from an exemplar, a model text. So the book in front of him is the book that he's working from, and then he's copying into the book on his lap. Generally, scribes wouldn't copy into an already bound book. They would just be copying onto those sheets of parchment, or the pages that have been cut out of the sheets. And then the very last step would be sort of binding into a book. So this picture is a little not totally correct, but still I think it nicely shows it. So you can see the scribe is working with a quill pen, often made from goose feathers, cut down. They take off the feather part. You see that in movies, but it would just get in the way. On the table, he has a small inkwell with ink usually made from either sort of soot black or what was the other? Oak gallnuts, which are these sort of growths that appear on oak trees that when mixed with different chemicals give a real beautiful, rich black, very carbon-full ink. That's also very, very durable. So that's probably what he'd be using in the inkwell. And you can see too, sitting beside the inkwell on his desk, this little object here is a penknife. So this would serve two purposes for the scribe. One is every now and then, if he needed to sharpen the edge of his quill, because they would get dull with use, he could just cut off a little more of that quill. So kind of like a medieval pencil sharpener. It's also kind of a medieval eraser too, because if the scribe made a mistake and noticed it, scribes made mistakes all the time. We have countless examples of scribal errors in the manuscript leaves that we have in our collection. You can see them crossed off, or sometimes they'll write, missing words above in the margins. Anyways, the penknife would allow you to scrape off the ink, the top layer of parchment, and rewrite it. Parchment's it's very, very durable, and it has a bit of give, so you can actually take a knife and scrape off a layer and if you made a mistake. So who were the scribes? Well, I should maybe talk a little bit about book production and kind of where that took place. So in the early medieval period, pretty much all book production took place in the monasteries that were scattered around Europe. These were really the centers of learning, and so the monks and nuns that were in those monastic houses, they would create or write out books for their own use, because of course the church had sort of an endless appetite for text, all the books of liturgy, kind of public worship, and books to do with theological matters. So the monasteries would create books for their own use, but they would also take commissions from those outside of the church. Merchants, nobility, the people who could afford to buy a book would hire monks to produce them for them. It was a way for the monasteries to kind of make money, really. Now that kind of changed as the medieval period progressed. Oh, but before I talked about how that changed, we have one example of a manuscript, or a portion of a manuscript leaf from that early period of kind of monastic book production. This is the oldest manuscript that we have in our collection. It's small, and age has not been kind to it. You can see it's very yellowed and stained. There's a number of holes in it. And part of the reason that it's in such rough shape is that it was actually, it looks like at one point it was actually used as a soft cover for another work. You can see kind of two lines in the middle, kind of running down here where the spine of another work would have been sewn in, and it would have been like a little soft cover. This kind of speaks to the fact that medieval peoples recycled like crazy. Parchment, of course, was a pretty valuable commodity since you had to raise and slaughter animals to produce it. And I was saying it was very durable. So rather than throwing out an old text, even if it was, hundreds of years old, maybe this book became obsolete, or maybe it was just falling apart and they'd already made a new copy of it. Rather than throwing it away, they'd sell it off to a bookbinder who would chop it up and use it to bind other books. So that's the only reason that this one has survived, because the original work has been lost. I didn't mention, but this just judging by the very sort of archaic handwriting known as Carolingian minuscule, or this could be another type of script, Proto-Gothic script. This is probably around 900 years old. So definitely within that period of monastic book production, would have been produced somewhere in a monastery by a monk who was a scribe. We recently figured out what this is. It's in Latin, like most medieval manuscripts, and we thought it was probably liturgical, or maybe not liturgical, but some sort of religious text. And recently, David Hittenrau, one of the English professors, managed to positively identify this as a biblical commentary called the Moralia in Job. It's a commentary on the book of Job in the Old Testament, the Hebrew Bible. And yeah, it was really cool to figure out what this was because it was a total mystery. But so this, yeah, again, oldest thing in our collection, and a nice example of kind of monastic book production. Things changed over time though in Europe. By the 13th century, the population was rising, cities were growing, trade was increasing, and the cities were becoming real centers of learning with the establishment of universities in major places like Paris, London, Bologna. And these urban centers became the new kind of center for book production, which moved out of the monasteries into the cities where a new types of kind of secular craftsmen took over the trade. So pretty soon, somewhere like Paris, right outside of Notre Dame Cathedral, was a real bookmakers area with parchmenters, with scribes, illuminators. Those are artists that decorate books, all kind of huddled around there. So, and these were like manuscript professionals, basically. Now I want to show you just as an example of this. This leaf is from the 13th century. It comes from a pocket Bible, a small Bible in Latin, since that was the language of the church. It's kind of interesting though, actually. I like this about this. Someone has written in sort of Middle English, they've translated a section of it here, which, yeah, is kind of interesting. Oh, you can see a mistake right here, a word crossed out. The reason I show you this is, yeah, the vast majority of the manuscript leaves in our collection come from that period of kind of urban book production, after it moved out of the monasteries into the cities. But this one is kind of special because unlike so many of them where we don't know the origin, we don't know who might have been involved with their creation, this one we actually have the name of the illuminator whose workshop produced this Bible. His name was William de Braille. He was an active and famous illuminator based in Oxford in England in the 13th century. And this is kind of cool. Most of these people, even if we know their names, and most of them we don't, they're anonymous scribes and illuminators. This one we actually know of a self-portrait of William de Braille that he painted into this Book of Hours, with him being blessed by God. Doesn't seem like the most humble kind of guy. Despite he looks like a monk because he has the tonsure and the robes, but he actually was he was a sort of, what do they call him? A sort of clerk in minor orders. So had some kind of religious status, but he lived outside of the monastery. He had a wife who was actually involved with his business. Women were very involved in the book trade, both sort of in the monastic setting and in the cities. It was one of the few trades that women could be fully participate in as scribes and illuminators. So anyways, he and his wife worked in Oxford and produced a lot of books. So anyways, kind of interesting to actually get to see someone who's associated with one of our manuscripts. Okay, so after the scribes were done their work of copying it out, this is what a manuscript would look like. Everything has been written out. You can see in black and red ink. The red they'd often use for, I don't know, kind of section headings, important bits of text, that kind of thing. It's called rubrication, from the Latin for red. And then it would be passed on to the illuminators if it was going to be illuminated. And again, illumination just means it describes kind of manuscript book decoration. So the thing to note about this one, this is kind of interesting because it was never illuminated, though it looks like it was intended to have been. So there's a number of spots you can see just on the side here. You can see a little tiny I right here, an L, and an R. Those are guide letters that and scribes would have put in guide letters as sort of notes to the illuminators, the artists that would decorate the book, to say what was supposed to go in the spaces that they left behind. So in these cases, it looks like they meant to have three illuminated initials added, but for whatever reason, it never happened. This is a page from a psalter containing the book of Psalms, the sort of poetry of the Hebrew Bible. And for some reason, this one was never finished. We just have the single leaf. Who knows what happened? Maybe the person, the patron that commissioned it, maybe they died, maybe they ran out of money, and for whatever reason, work was interrupted. Which is kind of nice because then it kind of freezes this thing in time and you get to see the guide letters, which usually are completely painted over. Sometimes too, they would have a space with little notes saying, oh, include here miniature. A miniature is just like a small illustration of St. George killing the dragon or something. But anyways, so it's neat to see those sort of scribal notes to the artist. Let's take a look at a completed or two completed leaves. These come from another psalter from the 14th century from England. And they're teeny tiny little things. They're about this big. But they're richly illuminated. You can see all sorts of wild stuff. They have like 3/4 borders that look like sort of tendrily vines and with leaves on them. You can see a number of all these illuminated initials of various sizes. And you can also see a number of these kind of horizontal bars decorated in gold, blue, and red. These are just they're called space fillers because often the artist would sort of embellish even the leftover kind of spaces left behind by the scribe. I don't know, in some ways it seems like the medieval mind kind of abhorred having negative space, and so they really tried to fill it in as much as possible. You can also see a few delightful little illustrations here. One here of a little bird. And then down here too, we have a human kind of figure. Unfortunately, his face got flaked off at some point, but wearing a hood and pointing up at a bit of text. Sometimes little figures like this actually served kind of a purpose, saying like this part of the text is really important. Sometimes things like this, the little bird, are probably just included as just kind of a little amusing, what they call a drollery, something to amuse the reader. Yeah, I love these leaves are quite fantastic. They're just so full of illustration. I want to talk a bit about some of the pigments used because yeah, it's important to know. You can see the bright colors have survived the centuries pretty much untouched. I mean, a bit of flaking, but I want to talk about the origin of some of the colors that you're seeing. So the paint that they'd be using would be a tempera paint. So this would be some sort of natural pigment providing the color from a vegetable or mineral source, mixed with a binding agent like albumin, egg white, to make it actually stick to the page. Now the pigments that they used came from a variety of natural sources. Everything was natural, no synthetic stuff in the medieval period. So the orangey red you see here might be ochre, a mineral which they grind up and then as I said, mix in with sort of egg white to make a paint. You can also see the white paint there is probably white lead, which is a very toxic lead salt, but provides a really nice and very durable white. The blue could be woad from vegetable, from I believe a root, or it could be azurite, which is a fairly common kind of blue stone found in parts of Europe that again they kind of grind up to make the pigment. The richest, most beautiful blues in medieval art, both in manuscripts and in panel paintings and other things, was ultramarine, which was a color made from ultramarine means from beyond the sea, and it was made from lapis lazuli, which is a semi-precious stone which came from beyond the sea. It came from in the medieval period. The only mines for it were in Afghanistan. So in order to get this stuff, you can imagine, camel trains bringing it to ports, maybe in what's now Turkey, and then shipping it across to, who knows, Italy, and then from there being sort of carted around Europe. Incredibly expensive stuff, just given how far it had to travel away, but it made the most richest, beautiful kind of blues out there. So there's some really interesting scientific analyses of the pigments used in medieval manuscripts, and I'd love at some point if they could do so, a spectrographic analysis of our leaves to tell us exactly what we have here. But you can also see a lot of gold leaf. So this is gold that's been beaten sort of paper thin, incredibly thin, and then they've applied gesso, kind of plastery glue, and then sort of cut out bits of this papery thin gold and applied it directly. They then sort of trim it and then burnish it up, often using like a tooth. A dog's tooth was supposed to be good for burnishing it, but burnish it up so it would just shine like the sun. Would have been pretty incredible. I want to show you one more example of an illuminated manuscript. We've got lots in our collection, but this one is kind of interesting. This is from sort of the more kind of Renaissance than medieval period. Comes from Paris around 1550 from the royal workshop of the King of France. This is, you can see with the notation, it's again a choir book leaf, but a small one meant to be carried around and sung from during the Mass. And one of the things that I love this initial here, it's got a strawberry flower and a strawberry, which alludes to the fact that often there would be symbolic meaning behind the decoration in books. So a strawberry, to a medieval reader, they'd put that together. This is a choir book leaf for the Mass to be used on Holy Saturday. So the kind of lead up to Easter Sunday, which is the most important celebration in the Christian church and the Christian calendar. And so, the strawberry here likely represents, to the medieval mind, it would have represented, because it's bright red, the blood that Christ shed on the cross for the redemption of humanity, which ties in nicely with kind of that Easter theme too. So there's always kind of subtext going on with illustration in medieval manuscripts. Okay, after the illuminator was done, all those leaves that made up the book, they would be sent to the bookbinder, who would sew them into a binding, and then it would get covers like the ones you see in front of you. These are two examples we have from the 16th century. They're made out of wood, covered in leather, which has been beautifully tooled to kind of give it that embossed look with all sorts of patterns, and then fitted with these looks like probably brass bosses on the corners and in the center, and this is to prevent the book from getting too worn, from that leather cover from getting too worn, because in medieval libraries they tended to stack books rather than putting them on their edge with their spines out. So yeah, this would provide a bit of protection for this beautiful binding that you've given it to. Okay, I want to talk a bit about how manuscripts were owned, or who owned them and how they were used. So, of course, not everyone would have owned a book or even have been able to use a book in the medieval period. Rates of literacy were low, though they did climb by the end of the period, but still it would be sort of a select minority of people that could actually read and write. People sort of merchant class, nobility, and certainly those involved with the church. And as I said before, the church produced a vast number and commissioned a vast number of works. Most of the manuscripts we have surviving from the Middle Ages are religious in nature, written in Latin, the language of the medieval church, and would have been used in sort of the liturgy and public celebration of the Mass and the daily kind of services. So to own a book, yes, you'd have to be literate. You'd also have to be rich enough to afford one of these. You can see from the description I've given you about how these things were produced that they were very expensive to produce. The materials, the pigments, the parchment, and then the skilled sort of labor that went into these, and the hours and hours of the work of scribes and illuminators, bookbinders, would have really added up. And so, and you can tell when you look at a medieval book, you can get a sense of sort of who the person who commissioned it was, just based on the level of illumination, say, that's in there. So yeah, so a lot of maybe I should talk a bit about sort of kind of mass ownership of books. It really didn't take place until maybe around the end of the medieval period, when books became again, with sort of rising literacy, and books became sort of more accessible to a larger segment of the population. Still a minority, but people like this woman were buying books, and the book that they were buying tended to be the what's been called the bestseller of the medieval period, the Book of Hours. I've talked about this a bit already. So this woman, she not much is known about her. She's anonymous, but just judging by her dress and other clues, she would have been from what's now kind of Holland, the Netherlands. And in her hand, she's chosen to have herself painted with her Book of Hours, which looks quite sumptuous with these gold borders on every page. Looks like gilded edges. And a lot of this was a common thing in medieval portraiture at the time, was choosing to have yourself painted with a prayer book. Is partly because it sort of shows you to be a pious person, or indicates that, but also these were kind of luxury items. These were you can see she's wearing her finest jewelry, which she's showing off in her portrait, but she also wants to be shown with her book, and that's probably could be the only book that she owned. If a household could afford a book, it would be just this one, a Book of Hours or prayer book. And they were super popular. People want to engage in the life of the professional religious. They want to kind of follow along with what the monks and nuns were doing in the monasteries, that daily round of contemplation, ruminating on God's word, thinking about, the mysteries of the faith. And so the Book of Hours kind of filled that void. And we are lucky enough to actually have a complete Book of Hours. Though it's interesting, this one, it looks like a manuscript, but it's not. So this comes from Paris, from around the time of that portrait, about 1521. And yeah, if at first glance you might think, oh yeah, it's a manuscript. You can see that it looks like handwritten kind of Gothic script. You can see all, illuminated with initials and these big full page kind of miniatures. But it's actually a printed book that's made to look like a manuscript. It's from kind of that early period of book production, when printing, or not book production, but printed book production, when printed books were kind of looked down on. People saw them as kind of a cheap alternative to manuscripts, which were the real prestige items. So in order to kind of respond to that, printers would try to make their books look like manuscripts, even if they weren't. And whoever commissioned this book, went the extra step too in hiring an illuminator, an artist, to actually go and overpaint a number of underneath that painting that you can see on the right. It's of the three magi, the three kings, presenting their gifts to the infant Jesus, just after his birth, the Epiphany. There would have been like a metal cut print underneath that one, printed when the text was printed. But then someone, as I was saying, has paid extra to have an artist paint over it to make it look like a nice illuminated miniature, which is, definitely speaks to the fact that this person had a bit of extra money to kind of splash out. I want to show you some more pages of this. It's really incredible. I should say too, the size of it. It's about, again, kind of about a paperback size, so fairly small, something that you could tuck into your robe, take with you as you went about your day. And it's really meant for kind of personal contemplation and devotion, kind of private readership, which is different than a lot of books in the medieval period. A lot of them were meant for kind of public recitation. So the Book of Hours sort of, I don't know, it ushered in sort of a real change in attitudes towards reading, whereas reading before had been more of a public activity. It was now seen to be kind of a private one, which accords more with what we we think of today. So all right, so what you see, sorry about that. What you see in front of you is this is the start of the heart of the Book of Hours. The Book of Hours has quite a collection of scripture readings, of prayers, a calendar of saints' days, all sorts of stuff. It's a real kind of motley collection of things. But at the heart of the Book of Hours is this. It's the office of the Blessed Virgin Mary. It's that kind of round of prayers and readings to be done daily, 8 times a day. You were supposed to stop and sort of break out your book of hours and follow along. And it's all kind of venerating Mary and asking Mary to intercede on your behalf. You as a poor sinner can't sort of approach God directly with your prayers. Instead, you would appeal to God's mother, Mary, to sort of intercede on your behalf and pray for you. So she held a really special place in the hearts of kind of late medieval people. A bit about the illustrations here. This is an interesting pairing. So on the left here, we have Adam and Eve being expelled from the Garden of Eden after they partook of the fruit of the tree of knowledge. So they're being cast out of the garden, which is shown as kind of a medieval castle. It's all done in this very medieval style by an angel with a sword. And so this is kind of representing humanity fallen, and then fallen into original sin. And then on the other side here, we have the Annunciation, which is the angel Gabriel coming to Mary and telling her that she's going to bear a son, and it will be Jesus, the Savior of the world, God's Son. And here's the Holy Spirit as a dove descending on Mary's head. So if on the left we have humanity fallen, here on the right we have humanity sort of redeemed through Mary's obedience. She brings the Savior of the world into the world. So a few notes about why they would have these beautiful illuminated miniatures. Well, part of it is they would be a great kind of devotional tool. So as you are reading, about Mary, you're saying prayers to her, you can focus in on an image of her at the same time. So sort of an icon-like quality to them, sort of a guide or a tool to kind of help you meditate on the mysteries of your faith. They also would help with kind of navigating the book itself. So medieval books didn't have page numbers, and I don't know if you've noticed that in some of the other examples I showed, but they really don't conform to sort of our modern structure of how pages should be laid out with, paragraphs and proper sentences with proper punctuation. Instead, the text relies for its structure on a lot of the illumination. So for example, we've got this big illuminated O beginning the section here. This would help kind of, the bigger the illuminated initial, the more important the sort of break in the text. So this is showing you this is a new portion of the text, and then each sentence after this has kind of a small illuminated initial, again showing that you're starting a new sentence. The big pictures too would help you kind of navigate the book. So if you're, it's midnight and you need to do the reading for prime, the sort of first hour of the day, you're flipping through your book and you're not exactly sure where it is, but you look for the image of the Annunciation and the expulsion from the Garden of Eden. That's the page you're looking for. So again, without page numbers, these sort of things help you kind of navigate the text. So there's a whole variety of meanings, as you can see, sort of, devotional, kind of luxury item, amusement, but then also kind of navigational. These are all reasons why books were illuminated. Okay, I've included these to just show you that there was a real range in the degree to which books were illuminated. So our Book of Hours, we have a page from it on the left. It shows, this is the beginning of the Office of the Dead, another section of the book. It's basically prayers to be said before the day before a funeral would occur. You'd hire monks to say this office. And ordinary people would say this regularly to take years off the amount of time their loved ones would spend in purgatory, that kind of waiting place before they go on to heaven, go on to paradise. So you can see here, it's a very kind of simple illumination, grim. It shows a corpse naked lying on the ground on a shroud in a churchyard. We can tell because there's a churchyard cross and a grave marker here. But then on the right, we have basically the same scene replicated in another Book of Hours from France a little bit earlier, late 15th century. But you can see the same kind of scene with the body in the churchyard, but it is incredibly elaborate. So you have an entire funeral going on with mourners, with monks. You've got all these figures around, this one's grim, death as a skeleton taking an infant from a cradle. But you can just see this book of ours, maybe would have been someone of merchant class, of modest means, only able to afford this level of illumination. But here is one from some super wealthy person, maybe a nobleman who's able to just really splash out and get an amazing illuminated manuscript produced. So again, attesting the fact that these were often kind of luxury objects, kind of conspicuous displays of wealth. Okay, let's talk about kind of what happened next. So, of course, in the 1450s, Johannes Gutenberg sort of kind of invented this new printing system. He took pre-existing technologies, the printing press, movable type, added in some of his own inventions, and basically created a super robust printing system that was easily sort of replicable, and pretty soon, within, he published his first the Gutenberg Bible, the famous Gutenberg Bible, in the 1450s in what's now Germany. And within a couple decades, printing presses were popping up all over Europe, and books were being produced in vast numbers. And pretty soon, the number of manuscript books declined rapidly as printing really took off. So, and this is a picture of a print workshop showing it was still a very manual process, but you could, the thing about printing is you could create a book in a much shorter period of time. You could print off hundreds or thousands of copies very, very quickly, way faster than it would take to write them out by hand. You could also, it also was therefore cheaper because it didn't take as long. So the cost of books came down, book ownership increased. And finally, too, these books, every copy of the book coming off the printing press would have been the exact same, like completely accurate, reproduced totally accurately, which was also a change from, the days of manuscripts when scribes would make mistakes and text would get corrupted. The other thing that the printing press allowed was for the reproduction of images. So I've got some examples here. Here is from a famous, one of the sort of most well-known early illustrated books. This one published in 1494, just 40 years after Gutenberg kind of invented his printing system. These are two leaves, I should say, from the Nuremberg Chronicle, a history of the city of Nuremberg in what's now southern Germany. And you can see how so these would be woodcut prints, so wood blocks that would be sort of engraved by hand, and then printed alongside the text. So you could illustrate text very, very easily with these things. And you can see the level of detail is pretty incredible. So just zooming in a bit here, so that's the city in Hungary. Over here we have various saints, and down here some heretics as well. So this allowed images to be reproduced on a mass scale. Before this, anytime you wanted a image produced in a book, you would have to have an illuminator draw it out, paint it in by hand. Here you could produce thousands of copies very, very quickly, which really kind of democratized the production and the sort of ownership of images, allowed for kind of mass communication and propaganda. The effect of the printing press and movable type in Europe is revolutionary. Enabled the Protestant Reformation, allowed the reformers to get their ideas spread out there. It also allowed images to be reproduced. You could suddenly create political cartoons, send them out en masse if you want to sway people's minds. It just allowed for the spread of ideas in a huge way. I wanted to show you one more example of kind of early printed book illustrations. This comes from a prayer book called the Book of Christian Prayer. It's sort of a Protestant answer to the very Catholic Book of Hours we looked at earlier. This comes from London under Queen Elizabeth I, published in 1590. And you can see it's in English, which is kind of a break with all those medieval books in Latin, the language of the medieval church. And this is just decorated with the most amazing kind of border illustrated borders. So you can see here, this is a very grim theme. It's the dance of death. So we have death as a skeleton leading off various members of Elizabethan society, from, you know, the Duchess and the Queen, people at the high end. Here we have the rich man's wife, the young woman, the maid, the damsel, and it goes right down to the cripple. You can see each one accompanied by a little bit of verse. So here, the maid, fresh, gallant, and gay, all must with me away. That's supposed to be death saying it to the maid. Basically, the message, as you can see there, is, you know, no matter who you are, you're gonna die eventually. So it's also a moral message. Put your trust in God, and, you know, trust, sort of work towards your salvation. Trust in His mercy and salvation. So, anyways, absolutely beautiful woodcuts. I love this book so much for them. So. Okay, so I talked about how manuscripts really declined. You know, who's going to pay to have a book written out by hand when you can easily get a nice illustrated copy printed off, you know, for a fraction of the price. But that isn't to say that manuscript production disappeared entirely. In parts of Europe and parts of the world, it went on for centuries. And I've got a nice example here. This is a complete manuscript, again, handwritten, Bible produced in Ethiopia by the Ethiopian Coptic Church. This comes from the 19th century. So it shows you that even 400 years after Gutenberg, books were still being produced by hand and being used. You know, sometimes because the technology wasn't there, other times for kind of cultural or religious reasons, they stuck with the old ways. So absolutely gorgeous illustrations in this one in that very traditional Coptic style. Okay, and that kind of brings us to the end. I hope this has been a useful overview of how, you know, medieval manuscripts were produced, and you've learned a bit about illumination and why so many medieval books were so beautifully illuminated. If you were interested in taking a closer look at any of the items that or that I included in the presentation, you can go to our website. So we have a nice archives database at the address just at the top, archives.mtworld.ca. And you can search for if you just search manuscript, you'll find our medieval and early modern manuscript collection. We have high resolution scans of most everything in our collection available that you can take a look at or download. You can also look at the early print collection. That has all the, you know, the early printed books that I was just showing you from the first 150 years or so of printing. And yeah, and once the archives reopens, once the pandemic restrictions are over, you're also free to come in and actually take a look at these in person. They're amazing to look at. So yeah, I encourage you to do that. You can also get in touch with me at any point. My address is up there, email address, phouston@mtworld.ca. Okay, thanks for watching, and I hope this has been informative. And yeah, great.